Welcome to Coach Taylor's class video. Today we're going to talk about the various angle relationships that we're going to use for the rest of the school year in geometry. And so let's start with some definitions and then we'll look at some examples. So when we're talking about vertical angles, we're talking about two angles that are across from each other on intersecting lines. They are always congruent. So an example is, let's say we've got line L, and then let's say we've got line M. So what this tells us, these vertical angles, so because we have two lines that intersect, our opposites are going to be congruent. So let's call this angle 1, let's call this angle 2. So the measure of angle 1 is going to be congruent to the measure of angle 2. It also works out that because those two are opposite, these over here are also opposite and would also be congruent. So let's call them 3 and 4. So the measure of angle 3 would be congruent to the measure of angle 4. So again, this only works when they are on the same two lines that intersect, and they also need to share this vertex right here. And so that's how we know what vertical angles are. Next, we're going to talk about adjacent angles. So adjacent means two angles that are next to each other and share a common side. So let's say that we have angle ABC. My two adjacent angles are going to be angle 1 and angle 2 because they share this ray right here. Let's call it BD. So again, they have to share that side or share that ray for them to both be adjacent angles. Next, we're going to talk about complementary angles. So complementary are any two angles whose sum is 90 degrees. So we can have, let's say, this angle here, which is 30 degrees, and then this angle here, which is 60 degrees. These two angles would be complementary angles. We also know that complementary angles, so let's say we have a right angle, and then we have ray AB in the middle of this right angle. We would know that angle 1 and angle 2 would be complementary because the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 would equal 90 degrees. Supplementary angles are very similar to complementary angles. The only difference is their sum is 180 degrees. So again, we can have this angle over here, which is say 100 degrees. We can have this angle here, which is 80 degrees, and these two angles would be supplementary angles. We also know that if we have any two angles that share a straight line, so let's say we've got ray AB here, that makes these two angles complementary. So the measure, we're going to call it angle A, would be plus the measure of angle B, we're going to call that other one angle B, would equal 180 degrees. So we have a little trick to help us try to remember complementary and supplementary. So complementary, the letter C, we can very easily turn into a 9 for 90 degrees. For supplementary, we start with an S, and we can very easily turn an S into an 8, and it equals 180 degrees. And so that's just a little trick. C gets us to 90, S gets us to 180. And so now our last definition is going to be linear pair. A linear pair combines two of these definitions. It combines adjacent with supplementary. So the biggest difference between supplementary and linear pair is supplementary does not have to be next to each other. So if I'm looking at supplementary angles, I could have two perpendicular lines, and I would know that angle 1 and angle 3 equal 180 in our supplementary angles. But angle 1 and angle 3 would not be a linear pair. So again, we have to have a linear pair, has to be on a straight line, and they have to share a ray or share a side. So here, angle 1 and angle 2 would be a linear pair, which means they would be next to each other, which means they would be on a straight line. So if I go back to my perpendicular line example, for it to be a linear pair, they would have to be angle 1 and angle 2. That's how we would have to have a linear pair. They would have to be next to each other and share that side. All right, we got a couple of theorems that we are going to see in practice problems and see throughout the year, and these are just some quick things that we need to make sure that we know. So if two angles are complements of the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. So what we know about complementary angles is they have to equal 90 degrees. So anytime we're talking about congruent complements theorem, we're talking about 90-degree angles. So if we look at this example image on the left, so if I have, if I know that angle ABC and angle CBD are complementary, so that means they equal 90 degrees when added together. And if I know that angle CBD and angle DBE are complementary, then what I know is I know that angle ABC is congruent to angle BDE. So real quickly, if I know that ABD is 90 degrees, and then I know that angle CBE is 90 degrees, what I then know is that ABC and DBE are congruent because they both share angle CBE, and if both sets are complementary, then I know that those two angles are congruent. And so our congruent supplements theorem is the same thing, except we know that supplementary angles are 180 degrees. So again, if two angles are supplements of the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. So if we look at our example to the right, so if we know that angle ABD and DBC are supplementary, so they equal 180 degrees, and I know that angle ABE and angle CBE are supplementary. Sorry, that's supposed to say supplementary. I forgot to change it when I copied the text. So if I know that those two are supplementary, then I know that DBC and CBE are congruent. So angle DBC is congruent to angle CBE. And so those are our congruent complements theorem and our congruent supplements theorem. All right, so now let's see if we can identify our angle relationships based on images. So let's look at this first image here. So I have two lines that intersect and have the same vertex, and I know that they are opposite of each other. So I know that those two are vertical angles. They're not adjacent, which means they can't be a linear pair, and I'm not given any right angle markers, and I'm not given any straight lines. So vertical is the only option for 1. All right, let's look at angles 1 and 2. So if I know that this right here is a 90-degree angle and this is a straight line, I know that this right here is a 90-degree angle. So again, I can quickly turn that C into a 9, so that tells me that these two angles are complementary. I also know that they share a ray, so they are adjacent. If they are complementary and adjacent, I know they cannot be vertical. If they are complementary, they cannot be supplementary. And if they are not supplementary, they cannot be a linear pair. All right, our next one here. So angles 1 and 2 share a straight line. And so I know that straight lines, because my S get me 180, so that's going to be supplementary. I also know that they share a side, which makes them adjacent. If they are adjacent, they cannot be vertical. If they are supplementary, they cannot be complementary. But if they are adjacent and supplementary, that tells me that I have a linear pair. All right, so let's look at this example. Here I am not given any 90-degree markers, so they cannot be complementary. I do not have a straight line, so they cannot be supplementary. And if they're not supplementary, they cannot be a linear pair. The two angles share a ray or a side, so I know that they are adjacent, but they are not opposite, so they cannot be vertical. All right, now let's look at this one right here. So angles 1 and 2 do not share the same side, so I know they are not adjacent, but they share the same set of lines and have the same vertex. So that tells me that, yes, they are vertical. And because I know they're vertical, I know that they are congruent. Because I know that they are congruent, let me back that up. So I know that they are congruent. So angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. I know that angle 1 and this angle, we're going to call it angle 3 right here, form a 90-degree angle because they are on a straight line right here. And because this is a 90-degree angle, I know that that is a 90-degree angle. I know that 1 and 3 are congruent. Because I know that 1 and 3 are congruent, I also know that 1 and 2 are congruent. So I know that 1, the measure of angle 1, plus the measure of angle 2 is going to equal 90 degrees. And I can easily turn my C into a 9, so I know that they are complementary. Once I know they're complementary, I can cross out supplementary and linear pair. All right, so now let's look at our last example. So I see that these two lines, they are intersecting lines, which tells me immediately that angle 1 and 2 are congruent. So that makes them vertical. And they are also opposite of each other. If they're opposite, they cannot be adjacent. I know that angle 1 is going to have a 90-degree angle because of this box right here. If they are both congruent, that means that one's also 90. So the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180 degrees, which tells me that these are supplementary. But since I crossed out adjacent, they cannot be a linear pair. All right, so I real quickly want you to write the inverse, converse, and contrapositive for the statement. And then for the statement below, I also want you to give me a counterexample. You can check with the completed notes to see if you were correct.